We could just do that for an hour. Oh, hello.
Podcast.
Hello,
Looks like we're live.
We are live
Okay.
at Ice and Fire Con online.
Hey, everybody.
Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us in
Good
this.
morning, Westeros.
Hello.
Time to smell up and smell the ale.
I got it pulled up on my little mini screen here.
Okay.
I've got my notebook.
Let's see how everybody's doing. So we should introduce ourselves and then give everybody a minute to, pile in here.
Yes. Also,
Sounds good to me.
I'm gonna say. Let's see. So again,
I
I
just
just
went
want
ahead and
to
pulled our profile pictures from Facebook because I don't know what else to do sometimes.
say that works just fine. But no,
Mark, can
I
you
want to
hear us,
thank.
hon?
I can hear everybody. Can you hear me?
I can't hear Mark.
Can't hear Mark? I can hear Mark.
I can't hear Mark at all.
Uh-oh.
Oh. No, I'm talking and.
Hello,
Can you hear?
everybody.
You can hear me, but not Mark?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine, Aziz. That's weird.
That's weird because I can hear Mark.
And I can hear everybody.
Huh.
No, I can see your mouth moving, Mark, but I cannot hear you, my friend.
That is so weird that you
no.
can hear me and not him. Okay, well, Tara says she can hear everyone, so maybe we should just proceed. Since I can hear both of you guys, we can.
Yeah, maybe I'll just click.
As long as the chat can hear Mark, I'm happy.
It sounds like they
can.
can.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Alrighty. So, hello everybody. Welcome to A World of Our Own, where we're going to discuss not only the world building process that J.R.R. Martin was assumed to have used in creating the world of Ice and Fire, but also how to possibly create your own world when in D&D, LARP, or if you're building your own story. So, let's go ahead and slide to the next slide.
Let's do that. Let me make sure. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Make sure I understand how this thing works. Looks good so far.
Hello. We are your weirdos today. It's nice to meet you. We're seeing you again.
Hi, fellow weirdos.
My name is Shelley. I have been cosplaying for over 12 years now. I began reading Ice and Fire, I want to say about 5-6 years ago, and I forgot the question that we were supposed to answer because I'm really
it was basically like one place in a swap you wanted to visit.
What was the question we were supposed to answer?
Oh, can't hear me.
He said it was what place in Westeros would you want to visit?
Oh, what place would I want to visit? Honestly, I'd like to go to Highgarden. I'd like to see the vineyards in the summertime and see just how their gardens are, how they look in the different seasons.
Yeah, and drink some of that fine Highgarden wine. And maybe get lost in the hedge maze, right?
I'll drink for that.
Gotta have that's the first. I think it's probably the first thing we should say, that if you are creating a world, it has to have a hedge maze. So just jot that down. If you're taking notes, hedge maze number one. Everything else kind of optional. Mark, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. All right. I'm Mark. I've been attending Ice and Fire Con for several years. I don't know how long anymore. Obviously read the books, watched some of the show, started volunteering. Then somehow that led to panels, being in the musical. And I'm coming to this panel kind of from a more D&D based context. I've played D&D for a while. I've made my own worlds and homebrew kind of things. So that's kind of why I'm here. Also, I've read World of Ice and Fire cover to cover like twice for some reason, just because I just couldn't sleep. So that's always fun to have that random trivia in my mind. And that's about it. Now move on to Aziz.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'm Aziz. I'm from the History of Westeros podcast. Is my fourth Ice and Fire Con. And I'm a pro podcaster these days. And I've been a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire since about 2001. And I love world building. World building is one of the things that I'm most attracted to with in general about fantasy worlds. and I think there's just so many fun things you can do. I've played lots of D&D when I was younger. I'm not actively playing right now, but you never forget. And of course, with George R. Martin, there's so much to dive into with his world building influence, his role playing, other authors, just his own imagination. And so it's fun to look at some things that are a little bit maybe standard or expected variations on, and other things that are completely imaginative and new, and everything in between. So hopefully we'll introduce you guys to some new things and shore up some things you already know. Looks like we lost Shelby, but she's back now, just in time.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi. I was just doing my intro and I just finished.
Now.
That's
Fantastic.
great. So your timing is perfect.
Oh, also, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention places I'd like to visit.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't say that.
Me neither.
Yeah. So I'll do mine too. Specifically in Westeros, I'd say I'd want to go to Dorne, Sunspear. I like Dorne a lot, so that's cool. Outside of there, I'd love to go to like Bravos or Lys or the Summer Islands, just because they have a very open culture that I think I would fit in very well, even though I'm really weird in regular culture. So
I have to echo Lys. I mean, that's where they have the pleasure garden. That's where the like Targaryens would go to like have summer vacation. So you can't go wrong with that one. But like also, I'll say,
party in Lys, let's go, man.
Right. I'll also say Old Town though, because that's the Citadel. They got the books there, and that's got to check out those books. Plus, it sounds like it's a relatively clean city as far as these things go. So it sounds pretty good. Oh, it looks like we lost Shelby again.
Oh.
Bummer. Well, she'll be back, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Let's go to our next slide and see if we can.
Oh, we got some pictures.
How about that? Yeah, we got some cool art here. We have the basics, I suppose. This would be Shelby talking normally, but I can run with it here. So welcome everybody. I can't see who's here. We can see comments though. So if anyone has questions, we can certainly see those. I can see Scott and Hedgehogs and Cats Are Life. I see Warren and Dom and everybody. Shadowcat, Heathen King. Great to see everybody.
Yes, again, thank you for.
Looks like I think she's back now. So we have the basics for world building, I suppose you could say. Maps and geography, culture, political systems, race, and magic. And this is maybe a loose ordering. Obviously, there's no set order you have to create things or build things, but it's a lot of people would say starting with maps or geography is a good place to start. And for me, that makes a lot of sense because a lot of things are based on that, right? Like where the borders are, where the mountains are versus where the rivers are is going to determine where cities are and where cultures maybe have their border clashes and things like that, and how religions are formed and what the religions are based on. So I think that's a really good place to start. What's interesting though is that a lot of authors don't start that way. Some of them do, of course. Some of them, the map is the first thing they do. But say, for example, George R. Martin, there was barely a map at the end of the first book. There was more maps by book 2, but they still weren't fully developed. So it goes to show that's not how it always goes. Yeah. Hey, Shelby, we were just talking about some of the basics here about starting with maps.
Sorry about that. I had to locate being in my bathroom. Apparently, when I usually do TikToks in there, it's fine. But apparently, StreamYard hates it. So.
StreamYard is its own little animal.
Excuse the crappy light.
You're killing it. It's good lighting for you.
So I just started talking about geography and how borders and things are a basis for one of the main bases for starting off with world building. But and then I mentioned that but some people, even like George R. Martin, don't necessarily start with that. So it's not it's not where you have to start. It's just kind of a normal thing.
Correct.
So how about cultural aspects? That's another major one. Sometimes that's a way to start. You have an idea for a culture or several cultures or how they interact, and you can run with that. What are some experiences that Shelby and Mark, what are some of the places that you guys have started with, say, campaigns you've been a part of, or your own projects or anything like that? Does it kind of echo what you guys have done, or is that maybe a little different approach?
So
No.
typically when I'm running a campaign, I DM quite a lot. I'll always start with my characters' backstories, those who have started, and I kind of build my world around that, around the problems I want to give them. And then I'll go from that to making a map, and then I'll jump into filling that map.
I usually started. I know that when I first started running things, I had nothing in mind. I just kind of, I kept the way I ran things pretty simple, and I just kind of started improving. Like, okay, now you're going to come across, you'll see mountains to this side, or you'll see a river to this side. As I started losing track, I decided it'd be better to kind of rework what I had. I basically did one of the standard methods that I've seen people do for making a map, and I just kind of ran with it. And so I kind of built out and expanded and detailed and kind of doodled out this map really quick and just had that. And I think that works pretty well, because now it's just a matter of I can show this continent to anybody and go, okay, so where are you from? Like where are you from? How did you get from point A to point B? In the setting, and each different area has its own culture and geography, and it's like, okay, if you want to be from the mountains, okay, here's what's around there. These are things that can do that. And most of the time, I've had a good chunk of players who are pretty adaptable. So it's if you give them, you could either ask your players and then make the map around them, or you can make a map and give it to your players. It works pretty well no matter what.
Yeah.
I forgot
But that, I decided, quarantines, I've actually kind of decided I'd try and run something. And so I'm like, okay, how do I have a little bit of everything in a province? And I just ran it during a lunch break and just kind of drew it up. So, it's like whatever, again, a little bit of every kind of geography and different areas of towns and stuff like that, and where things could be going, just so I have it in case I need it.
That's probably a real required piece of discipline when you're world building, right? Like do you want to put a lot in, or do you want to keep it more bare on purpose, or do you want to try to, is it, like putting in too much or too little? It's probably kind of one of those things that you never can feel like it's complete because it's a whole world. So you can always add more to it. But once you make a decision, it's semi-permanent. So you don't want to like commit to something you're not happy with. It's kind of fun.
Right. And that's the thing, is I've tried to do that before, with like, especially when you think like in a very high fantasy thing like Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games, where it's not just the planet, fictional planet. You're dealing with the heavens, the hells, the abyss, the material and elemental planes. It's all these things that you can kind of finagle into your game, and how those now start affecting. There's obviously, I'd consider ASWAF to be a very low magic setting. There's no spell slots and fireballs and illusions, like suggestion spells kind of thing. But it does have magic, and that does obviously affect the world in some way, which we'll get into later.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's move to the next slide here.
Let's go ahead and jump into our
One thing I think is really interesting about maps.
Wall of words.
Yeah, you like our random wall of words. One thing I think is super interesting about maps is that how they're super crucial to fantasy campaigns and books and settings. What's so neat about that is that in the real world, maps in fantasy settings or medieval settings are pretty anachronistic. They didn't usually use them very much. So that's kind of a neat thing, that even authors who are like, I don't really want to make a map, they kind of get forced into it, because even if they don't want to do it, the fans are like, no, we have to have a map. You just have to have one. Tolkien, of course, famously put a ton of work into his before letting it see the light of day. Whereas, as we just mentioned, Martin kind of did it a little bit by little bit. And for another example, Andrzej Sapkowski for The Witcher, he didn't want maps at all, but his game or his books got adapted into a video game, which you just got to have a map if it's going to be a video game setting. Like, so another thing where the fans just fan demand just overcame any authorial desire, which I'm sure game masters have that same thing happen to them sometimes, where their players are like, we got to have this. And you're like, okay, well, I'll give it to you.
And that's the thing I think that I think is good, like why people like maps so much, is that you can now
Having a
see
map.
things big picture. No pun intended. It can be, okay, so we're here on this map and we want to go here. Here's the things we have to now come across. And it's something that, based on, if you're thinking in Game of Thrones, it's they don't have those as his access. So it's just, you just have to like remember, and you just have to know it. Where it's just, the map makes it easier for, any kind of setting. It could be fantasy, sci-fi, whatever. If you have the map, you know where you can be going from that.
Yeah, because if you were a character living in that world, you would know, because you live there, you would have a sense of where everything is.
Yeah.
You can't just give that to a reader by description, at least not quickly. Right. if you need to teach someone about the world, it takes chapters or descriptions, etc. But so a map is kind of a fast forward to through that process, I think. Plus, it's bottom line too, they're just so fun and cool. There's always that, right?
Oh yeah, I'm staring at. I actually have one of the Westeros puzzles that I've had it for years and I can't put it together because some of the pieces just don't fit. But I have like it's the show one, if that makes any. But like there's like just so much black water and I can't figure out which piece goes where. But
I know what you mean. The show, we have that same one, and our cat peed on it because I think he doesn't like the Essos version. The show version. He likes the book version, so he destroyed it. It's like, no, this map is false. Shelby, are you back?
Yeah,
I think so.
Thanks. I don't know if she can hear.
I am trying to be. I'm downloading Chrome.
Well, I'll read a few user comments while you're trying to get back in here. Then I'll give us a minute here. I see a couple comments from Amy Lantrop, who says that starting with backstories is a good way to go, because you can fill out the characters in the world that way. You can, with their backstories, you realize what world details you need to include or what matters most.
Yeah,
you can kind of take a character-driven approach, and wherever the characters have been and done, or where they're going to go, that's the parts of the world you need to work on, or that need working on if you're a writer or what have you.
Yeah, I know. At least for me personally, I've had to kind of pull teeth with my players to just get a paragraph of backstory for them. So if you're into, I mean, that's just, some players are like that, and I just had to go, okay, like I wish I could get backstory out of all of them. I know in the next campaign I'm running, I'm asking for a page,
nice.
which is slightly ambitious, but because of all of my history with trying to get a paragraph, but I do think that having a more character-driven story is good. The one that I'm running currently is more so like my first attempt at like trying to do it. So I wanted to just try and again, it's getting into, at least for the game mechanics and something in fantasy, is everyone knows like there's a slight difference between railroading and sandboxing. And with this being my first foray into trying to run things, I kind of went the more railroad route, just so I know it'd be a little bit easier on my end.
Yeah, right. It really, you can give them a little bit of the work. So it's all fair.
But the next one I intend to do is going to be much more sandbox, because they have the continent now. They can do whatever they want. It's not up to me.
Hi.
Hey. We're so sorry you're having trouble. It's not your fault.
I hate the internet.
Yeah. It's rebelling against you. Talk about, we need to, next world you build will have good internet.
Yeah.
So I switched over to my computer, so please excuse the absolute chaos behind me.
That's all right.
Okay. I have been listening though, so at least I'm not gone.
Well, did you have anything to add to the recent, the things we were talking about, or should we continue moving on?
I do actually. So if we want to, we're finished with this slide, correct?
I can move on. Yes, let's do that.
Yes. So this is a map I was able to find through a bunch of digging. So when G.R. Martin was first creating the map of Westeros, he made a comment to an interviewer where he stated that you don't really have to go far if you're really struggling to figure out a map for your world. You can grab a random country out of the world and flip it upside down, flip it sideways, and find what you like. He used a method that's called map modification. Famously, we have he's flipped Ireland up on its head. And his reasoning for doing this is actually the what we know as the Fingers, or the Donegal Peninsula, is his inspiration for doing that, because he specifically wanted that area. So he just flipped Ireland over, you know, whatever. But another
flip it and make it a lot larger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bigger, add a little broken arm for Dawn.
Yeah.
A couple features that are also included, but I didn't make a slide for each of them, are on the other page, because I have a notebook full of scribbles. King's Landing was based after Galway. Donegal Bay was supposed to be the Sea of Dorne. Belfast was Old Town. Dublin was Casterly Rock. Winterfell was based off of Sheffield and York, which ironically is where Sean Bean is from. He's from Sheffield, so he had a nice little time there.
Yeah, Yorks and Lancasters, Starks and Lannisters. There you go.
Yeah. Wales is supposed to be the Stony Shore. Hadrian's Wall, which is, for history buffs, know it as the Romans' final defense to try and keep the quote-unquote barbarians out of their lands when it was the barbarians' homeland, you know. That is the wall itself. And Loch Ness is the god's eye. The shape matches up almost identically. And the Humber Estuary is where the trident is. So
right on. There's one other cool one. There's the Castle of Dunstanburgh, which was a castle that a rebellious lord fled to when there were some troubles after he had failed to be part of a rebellion. And this is the story of the Manderleys, because their original castle was Dunstanbury, and they fled from Dunstanbury after a failed rebellion type situation that's a little bit unclear because it's in the fog of ancient Westerosi history. But it's yet another example. George was super inspired by, as you saw from Shelby's examples, by these locations and this setting. And good job, George. It worked.
good job. You took English history and said, I'm going to make it my way.
Yeah, flipped it on its head, like you said. It's basically,
I'm going to make it my way and add dragons.
Figuratively and literally it works, yeah.
Make it my way and add dragons. So,
next slide.
Next slide.
All right.
So a few tips when making your own maps for your own worlds. There's a couple of methods that are pretty fun and work rather well, especially if you're on time crunch. My personal favorite method is the dice drop method, where you take a number of D&D style dice. If you have a bag of them, it helps.
Yeah, you need
you give each type of your dice a specification. So like your blue dice may be the oceans or waterways, or brown dice may be mountains, etc., etc. Shake them up, toss them on the floor.
Like one of those trucks full of dice that crashes on the interstate.
Yeah, pretty much. Trace an outline around where your dice have fallen, and then take note of what number is on each die. This will tell you a little bit more about the landmarks in the area that chaos has created.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
A similar method is the rice or noodle method, which has less specification to it, but creates much more intricate border lines. So you take a bunch of rice or macaroni noodles or rotini or whatever you got on hand that's dry, shake them up, toss them on a piece of parchment paper.
This was news to me too. I was really waiting to hear also, like a lot of you, why there was rice in this slide. So now I know, and that's a great reason. That's really cool.
I would have to suggest don't use spaghetti.
Yep, just one long strip.
And don't use cooked rice either.
Yeah.
That'll just be one clump. Your world will be a clump.
Yep, that's what we call space.
White space.
Yes. Literal white space. The other method is the map modification, which is what G.R. Martin used. Tolkien also pulled a little bit in, but Tolkien was much more for the scribble method, where you just take a real-life country or a real-life inspiration, flip it around, change a few names, and go to town.
One thing we didn't mention from the last slide is occasionally when the author doesn't fill something out, fans will do that for them, either encouraging them to or actually doing the work themselves. We cited Michael Klarfeld, who's work is seen in a lot of History of Westeros projects, but just out in the internet in general. He's just a great map maker. And we used the example of The Witcher before. He didn't like the maps that they had put out from the show and everything because there were problems with them. So he made his own. I mean, he's like, look, I'm going to do this better than any official production. So I just wanted to point that out because Michael's deserves a shout out, but also because it just goes to show the level of inspiration that maps and things can lend to people.
Oh, absolutely. It is a bit of a double-edged sword with artists doing that because once in a blue moon, you'll get the Anne Rice who is just like, what do you mean you changed something that I wrote? I'm going to sue you.
Yeah.
For no reason.
Luckily, George has seen Michael Klarfeld's maps up close and thought they were really cool. He was like, "Whoa, you did this?"
George is a chill guy most of the time.
He's like, don't let HBO sue you. That's what he said. Because clearly he's not going to. But
last method is. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
No, I was going to say based on Michael Klarfeld's map. He also has a habit of taking people. I'm sure you had noticed Aziz's profile picture was pretty well drawn.
Yeah.
Community members and kind of throwing them as like the NPCs to the flavor pictures of the maps. I think that's cool.
That's really good, yeah.
I kind of didn't know, like he did the known world, and then he did the Dawn, and I am now, I was lucky enough to, I don't know if it's an NDA situation.
No.
But I was lucky enough to be put into the Reach.
Yeah.
We'll be in that. I'm sure Aziz and Deshaya and several other people from History of Westeros will probably make an appearance in
it's an honor.
It's really cool because I'm like, wow, I'm drawn in a map that people can like put on the wall. And like,
it's so cool.
Your artwork now. And now everyone knows it. You deserve to be seen as artwork. Everyone does.
It's a very special thing, but that's all I need.
Sorry.
No.
My mic is crap. We're on.
You sound fine. You sound fine.
The last method I will go really quickly because we're running a long time. Scribble method is what Tolkien used. As you create your chapters, you're just like, I'm gonna real quick and scribble whatever you like on your map to later detail however you choose. That's why the original maps of Middle Earth are very kind of sketchy and clumped together. It's because each time he would finish a chapter, he would detail the map a little more.
Oh, that's cool.
Okay, now we can go.
Religion, culture, all right.
So let's go ahead and talk about ancient religions versus modern religions and how they affect not only Game of Thrones, but any worlds you guys want to build. Religion is a stepping stone of not only human society, but human culture, as anyone who studied ancient history will tell you, and just fun to mess with. Ancient religions typically are based on nature, and they are most often polytheistic. There are a few that will go off after a single god, but this is just speaking on a broader spectrum. You're going to see much more nature-based gods where they do have flaws. They are not singularly omnipotent. They do see what you do. You have the possibility to fight them. Real-world examples would be Norse and Celtic paganism. Hinduism is a nice little mix of the two. But the traditional pagan religions, Native American culture is, without calling them God specifically, will focus more on ancestor worship and nature worship. So in Game of Thrones, we see this represented very well with the drowned god, even though he is a monotheistic deity, is very much, he can become enraged, he can be pacified, he has human qualities without being a human. But he is singularly nature-based. You fuck with the sea fucks you up.
Yeah.
And the old gods of the North are very much so based in traditional Celtic and Norse pantheons. But I'm going to pass over to Aziz to talk about the Lord of Light.
The Lord of Light, yes. There's interesting twists with the Lord of Light. We have to look at it a little differently than some of the other religions because of the way it's introduced to us in the story. And that's a great example of how it can be used in a created world or any kind of story, which is that we're given a few misconceptions about how Relorism works because we're introduced to it through a character who is not a typical Relor worshiper or / priestess, which is Melisandre. For example, it's still, even now in 2020, widely believed that Relorists, that burning people is a normal part of Relor worship. But really, throughout the story, Melisandre is the only one who does this. We don't see any examples of it elsewhere other than people who are influenced by Melisandre. And if you go to, when we see places like the Red Temple in Volantis, and we see the head priest, and we see people like Makoro, Victarion burns people right in front of Makoro. So it's really easy to think that he had something to do with that. But if you, a close looking at that chapter reveals that Makoro had nothing to do with that. He's just like, okay, you want to burn people? I'm not going to say no, but
not going to say no, but that's not usually what we do, fam.
Yeah, so it's a good example of, and this is a really, the reason this is a good example for religion is because unlike most other things, religion is really to the extreme on something that people will misrepresent on purpose if it disagrees with their own religion, because religion is something that people absolutely fight over in a lot of real and fictional settings for obvious reasons. And so misrepresentation of religions is a big part of is a good part of a setting to have, because it's very realistic. It happens in the real world. Everybody knows just ridiculous stories that have been told about any real world religion. You name it. Just you can make up. We've all heard stories that are not rooted in any sort of truth or examples even given by the people who follow that religion. They come from outside it. There's stories told about it that do not represent it accurately. So I think the Melisandre thing is a pretty good example of that George uses, partly because the trick is still in play now. Like I said, a lot of people still feel that way. So it's a good example, I think, of how religious interplay works. Would they work with each other? Because there's obviously the internal workings of a religion, and then there's how it interacts with the world around it, which includes the other religions.
Yeah, and using those misunderstandings in your own worlds. I don't know. I'm sure English language. Mark, I don't know if you've used cults in your D&D campaigns or in your LARP settings, because I know that you are a master DM, and I've heard many stories. I've heard many stories, sir.
Well. Thank you. No, I think it's important if you're looking into a using a pre-existing setting, or if you want to make your own. Either you can. There's several different settings that each have their own pantheon. You can easily take one of yours, and if you like it, put it into yours. That's what I did with mine, because my particular game runs on a very heavy good versus evil dichotomy. So one specific setting was like, okay, here's like a bunch of good ones, here's a bunch of bad ones. That's all I did. Though if you wanted something more gray area based, there's a lot of pantheons that could probably be put into a world for that already. If you decided you wanted to make your own, or you're trying to build your own world somehow, look at the game. Usually there's obviously subclasses. We'll consider these cleric domains or such a thing, something similar in your game. To try and fill out each of those, or give your people all of those options. So I mean, you obviously certain things can vary, but you don't want to say, okay, so I'm going to make a bunch of gods and none of them have the nature domain, right? Like, so then you lose that kind of option for your people. There's a lot of good archetypes. Obviously, you can look at common mythology. You can take Greek or Roman mythology or Celtic, and you can put that as your gods in your world. Or you could just take things that you like and kind of piece it together. Again, keeping these large archetypes with that work in the game mechanic subclasses. Or if you're just writing a book, again, if you want to keep like the broad stroke archetypes for your specific pantheon, if you want to have more than one god, or maybe just a religious philosophy that kind of encompasses these things.
That's cool. That's really neat. We got a good question here that we should address before we move on. It says, it's from Hedgehogs and Cats Are Life. Also, I want to shout out Lydia Bringerud, who said, I love cults in the chat, which is kind of a troubling comment there. I love cults. I don't know. We may have to explore that later, Lydia. But Hedgehogs and Cats Are Life asks, are we going to talk about religious syncretism? Which is a great question. Yeah. And just as an example, I'll bring one up and then throw it back to my co-panelists here. Within the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, there was an attempt to sort of merge the religion of the Ironborn with the faith of the Seven. They tried to add the drowned god as one of the faces of God. It didn't work, because if it had, these religions wouldn't be so distinctly separate still, and you might have heard of this. It's just a small anecdote within the World Book, or Fire and Blood, whatever, same difference. And so even a failed attempt at syncretism, though, makes a story, right? Like all the attempts to do that can be a campaign setting. There's all sorts of cool stories and interactions that would come from something like that. Even a failure of religions trying to work together can create stories. They don't have to work for it to be interesting. I like that idea. And again, Victarion comes up as a good example here, because Victarion, when he burned those women, he was doing it as an offering to the Drowned God and R'hllor and the Seven, because it was a boat that was going to sink. They were burned for R'hllor, and he chose 7 of them, which so Victarion just trying to mash it all together. He's just a little for you, a little for this god, a little for that god. So.
And we did see a little bit of positive and perhaps successful syncretism in the idea of the faceless god. We see a lot of the followings and practices of the old gods and of the Drowned God and of R'hllor brought to the Temple of the Faceless, while also worshiping a god that is seen equivalent to the gods of the Seven. One who stands aside and watches, and yet is the same within and without.
That's a great example. And in Bravos particularly, which was founded by escaped slaves, they had slaves from a bunch of different nations. They respect religion because each of these slaves came from a different culture that had different religion, and they wanted to make sure all of them were represented and respected. So that's a good example of it working well together too.
A big thing to consider. Go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, not to be too cynical, but if we look from a more historical standpoint, syncretism doesn't often work. You just think of the Abrahamic religions. These are all the same God, all told a different way, and there's been a lot of bad things that people have justified based on those. You have the schisms, the diasporas, etc. I don't want to get into it because
those create great stories, right? Like a schism.
Awesome. It's very good history. It's very interesting stories. But again, it's chances of it all working out very unlikely most of the time.
That's kind of the shtick of world building in this too. Like, what's awful and terrible in the real world is fun in a role playing setting. Like a religious schism is awful in the real world, but in a role playing campaign, it's like, ooh, this is like top stuff.
It's very much so that people latch on to a certain philosophy for their own well-being, for their own comfort, for their own what have you. They enjoy this certain religion or philosophy or what have you, and eventually it gets ingrained within the culture, and when that happens, it's hard for them to alter it or change it to whatever it may be. So,
pulling off of that, as much as the religion itself is going to be important in your story, your campaign, or your setting, you need to consider the reactions of others who already follow other religions to the new instigations. In the real world, we had an uprising of paganism in the late 80s. And due to the very, very strong Catholic, Christian, and Protestant beliefs out in the Midwest and in the Great Bread Bowl at the time, it instituted the Satanic Panic. This, believe it or not, is on one of the milder ends of a very bad reaction to a new religion. Yeah. On the worst side of things, historically, we see the Roman Christians and Roman extremist Christians reacting to another uprising of paganism that was still very prevalent in the area by saying, either you join us or we literally yeet you into the ocean covered in tar.
It's very normal for an empire system because empires by definition contain multiple kingdoms and many types of cultures. There's almost no way to have just one religion within an empire. So generally to build an empire, you have to be tolerant. It's very common in world history, two of the largest empires that ever existed, Rome and the Mongol Empire. They both had a similar-ish approach to this, which was worship whatever god you want, but make sure you include the emperor in your prayers. That's required by law. So it's like whatever god you worship, make sure the emperor is like promoted within these prayers or the Khan or what have you. So there's ways for them to work together with an authority above it. But without that authority above it, like you said, it ends up coming a lot of ways, whether you're raised in a single religion that isn't exposed to other ones, or you're raised within a religion that there's other ones kind of nearby, or if you're raised in a religion where there's another religion nearby that's kind of the weirdos that aren't part of society. There's so many different possibilities. It's really neat.
Yeah.
All right, we are running low on time, so let's...
We are.
Are we?
Yeah, this one we'll just kind of jump over because I could go on for hours about the costuming and the architecture about Game of Thrones and how each one is related to something different around the world. But in your own creations and in Game of Thrones, in Lord of the Rings, you'll often see very popularized influences from ancient cultures with modern allowances. For example, Rome is very, very popular. Ancient Britannia is very popular. One of my favorite settings to use is ancient India. Whenever I run a campaign, it's very nice to play with the ancient caste systems and how you simply go from one sector of the city to another, and it's a drastic shift in how they dress, how they act, how they how they're visibly represent their own wealth. So
that's neat.
We see that as well in Ice and Fire, especially in places like King's Landing, where the upper echelon of the city is very much so based off of ancient Rome. But as you go into Flea Bottom, you see people are living in squalor. People, you can, I think the description from the book is you could smell the fleas on them from a mile away.
Yeah, the fleas could probably smell it too.
Yeah.
Just so we don't have to stick with, for the sake of time. If you can just look into like even if you can just flip through the World of Ice and Fire and get through just the castle keeps, each one is different in their own way. They are adapted to the geography around them. They are strategically done as a fortification to, whether it be the Riverlands keeps it on rivers, or the Winterfell is kind of based in this, kind of old magic, and it's on a hot spring, so it stays warmer. Sunspear has these long kind of snaked maze of a roads that only Dornish seem to have kind of into their memory, so invading Sunspear would make it more difficult. But like each keep and each kind of photo you see in there, each thing has a different form of architecture. It's almost in a different form, a different kind of cultural influence, and is again based on geography and the kind of stuff like that. And you can just look at that and you can see, hey, this kind of seems like, oh, I've seen this where, and
where have I seen this before?
You can see from the architecture and cities and stuff like that in ASWAP, and kind of piece it together from real world influences. And you can do pretty much take that same thing of, I like this architecture, I like this kind of area, and just put that in your own fantasy world, tweak things around a little bit, and there you go.
Yep, the beauty of modern allowances in creating our fantasy world is you can include things like bathrooms. Or magical ways of sending messages, having a raven fly literally an entire continent in a day.
Without using the bathroom. No.
At like Mach 5 or something like that. I think they could do that. Some smart person who does math or like figured it out. Like the raven needed to be going Mach something in order to get from the wall to King's Landing that fast.
We're veering off into Monty Python territory.
Yes.
What is the airspeed of an unlanding raven?
But yes, so when you're creating your own worlds or reading a nice heavy fantasy novel, take a look at the different setting pieces. Take a look at how the people are presented. Maybe you'll be able to pick out a few things just from the way they're dressed, or what colors they're wearing, what fabrics they're wearing, what kind of house do they live in. All right, let's zoom.
All right.
I just dabbed, and I didn't intend to dab, but okay.
Politics.
Politics.
Well done. Good dabbing.
Politics are my favorite thing to work with, because when you're creating a setting or a city, you're starting at the top most of the time. Are you having a monarchy? Is it a king or a queen? Are they corrupt? Do they have a council? Oligarchy, is it a single set of people that runs everything else? And are they corrupt, or are they truly trying for the betterment of the people? Theocracies is a nice little thing that can very easily tip into cult very quickly. We're looking at you, High Sparrow. We have democracies, which, as many people may or may not see, the best example of ancient democracies is when you look on a pirate crew. So we see much more democracy in the Greyjoys. Excuse my idiot dogs, which I'm sure you can hear.
That's okay. Dogs are a part of world building too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we see much more democracy in the Greyjoys than we do anywhere else in Westeros. They make everyone's voices known, and they make sure everyone has a say in choosing the next ruler. The Greyjoys are primarily based off pirate culture, so that makes a lot of sense. Dictatorships. Hello, Joffrey. One ruler, and either you follow the ruler or you get a crossbow at the butt. Anarchists are the most fun to play with, but also can very easily turn from well-intentioned people who are against the government to, no, we're just going to kill everyone now.
Motor hobos.
So sure that no matter what political system you choose, you have that very defined line of, is this good or is this bad? How much gray area do I want to play with?
Yeah, and there's like subgroups within there. For example, I see Wendy Nerd mentions mountain clans, and they're more of a proto. They're sort of democratic, but sort of, they have a clan chief, but the chief doesn't have as much power as a lord. It's I'm not sure what the right term for that is, but it's sort of a combination of some of these things. And there's a rule is more by consensus, not necessarily by a vote. But there's some family dynasty that does count for something. Blood does count for something in some of these situations.
Parliamentary monarchy is, I think, the term.
Okay, right on. Yeah.
It's what Britain currently has. Or tries to have.
Sort of, yes. They call it that. Yeah, it is technically the best kind of correct.
The best kind
Similar to saying that we are the bastion of democracy. That's totally true. We like to see ourselves. We're talking about politics. We can get a tad political.
So we did get permission to go longer, so we can keep going. Let's keep going then.
All right. Laws, crimes, and punishments. This is where shiz gets fun in your campaigns and your stories, because just as absolute power corrupts absolutely, some people are just lazy with their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest, when you're creating a government, you want to go from the top down. So we've picked out our leader. Let's say we've picked an oligarchy. So the council then sets the rules, and the rules must be followed. How are you implementing that people follow the rules?
Mm-hmm.
Do you trust your people to automatically follow? Are you going to set guards in place? How strict are the guards? Can the guards be bribed? Things like that are fun to play with. I once ran a campaign where everything in the town was extremist lawful good. And one of my players was arrested and put to a death trial for picking a flower in the private garden of the queen.
Well, you shouldn't have done that, clearly. Must have really wanted that flower.
I guess so. So it's something fun to play with. And we do see that all over Westeros as well. Particularly, I just had it in my head and then it ran away.
Well, we certainly have lots of trials by combat. That's a major feature of the story.
Yes.
And it is a very, politically and culturally, Westeros is very martial. You got to think that the Lord is judge, jury, and executioner in a pig thief. Whether or not they get lose a hand for stealing, or they are just flat out killed, or they are sent to the wall. Those seem to be kind of the only options in situations like that.
Yeah, and it's appealing to a higher power. The thing about trial by combat.
And trial by combat is appealing to a higher power, and hopefully you are lucky. But you got to think it's the Lord is in charge. The Lord Lord or Lady has their own slightly standing army with their bannermen. They are then kind of enforcing the Lord's law, which is then turned as an extension of the King's. And this obviously varies from place to place on how benevolent or malevolent your leader tends to be. I would say, if anything, to make sure in these situations politically is to, I think it's always important to keep track of what is happening with the small folk and the commoners in your situations. This is the thing that I wanted to bring up slightly culturally, as well as in the books. I feel like you look at it, we're not getting point of views from any small folk, with the exception of possibly Davos, that I can think of offhand.
Just prologue characters, yeah. I mean, we get Pate and Chet, which you can opt to not count that. Since they're only one chapter each.
Yeah, Davos is the only one that I think that's why a lot of people like Davos, is because he's the most humble. He was a common man. He just started learning to read, which again, that's another political issue of education, but what have you. That is definitely a thing that I think that's why people are drawn to him, and I think it's an important thing to work into your story because a lot of course, high fantasy and fantasy tends to focus on the higher people, but remember to think of the lower systems and how they are affected by everything, because you are, in many ways, especially in Aeswaf and similar fantasy, you are at the Lord's mercy, as far as whether or not you have to go to war or you just get killed for the slightest insolence.
That's why Davos is a great example there, because what makes him so attached to Stannis is just. His perception of Stannis is a very just man, and that's something that Davos was really moved by, that justice, because apparently it's a little bit rare, or a lot rare, and that's an important, like you said, that's an important part of like the small folks' conception of justice. Is someone that brings justice is like a revelation. It's like, wow, finally. Of course, your setting doesn't have to have that. A setting can be like Shelby described, where they have extreme justice, where like Davos picking a flower. What's the example?
Where'd you get them onions?
Example? Yeah, exactly.
Where'd you get them onions?
And there's other type of twists one can include. For example, on our slide here, it says, who does the laws benefit, and what is the process of due justice and due process and all that. Good example, Henry I in England. He didn't want laws to be written down. He didn't want them written down because he knew that lawyery people would interpret a letter of the law and be able to just walk right up to the edge of where the law is and not quite break it. And he knew that if you defined exactly where the law, or there's borders of the law are, people will take advantage of that and just go right up to that line and not cross it. Yeah. So by leaving the laws unwritten, the king has more leeway to enforce the spirit of the law, because if the letter of the law, people can get around that. There's technicalities, and so that's an interesting. Of course, the problem with that is, what if the king is Joffrey, and every interpretation is hypocritical or inconsistent, or so. Yeah, that gives you lots of options to work a story around.
Yeah, and playing directly off that, we run right into George R.R. Martin's political influences as far as making the political systems of Westeros. Most of us already know that the majority of the book is written based on the War of the Roses. This is something that I don't know how many of us have talked about in either drunken or sober discussions. He called in multiple of the Henrys, all of the Tudors, and the feudal systems to different parts of Westeros. But a few things that I don't know how often they're talked about is the idea of pane circuses in Essos, where we see it very commonly, especially in Dany's reign. The people are upset, the people are angry, and none of the higher class seem to notice because they're too busy looking, hey, dragon.
Yeah.
Hey,
you have a riot in book 2. I mean, yeah, you're right.
The slavery is over. It's from the outside very prosperous, very good. But what we're not seeing is the economy's crashing. We're not seeing the people are already uprising in the lower circles. Pane circuses in Essos is a constant theme, because even before Dany, we saw this starting to occur, and that's why Dany was able to take over so easily. Should a world be... We got a question from Kevin Wilson. Should a world be built top down or bottom up? That depends on personal preference. I like to go top down because I'll make a problem typically at the top, and that's my personal issue. And I like to see, okay, how would this person at their station react to it? And that will build my lower classes out.
Yeah.
I think you can do a little of both. Like, since there's so many things to build, like you have a political system, you have a geographical system. I think some can be built top down and some bottom up. It kind of, it really depends on where your ideas start, like where your creativity is rooting and where it's taking you.
I think that's the thing that often is a situation like that's because history major in me says we obviously focus a lot on political history and military history, and just it hasn't been too long that we've been focusing on social history, and that's pretty much the way I see it. If we stop looking at the leaders and we stop looking at the conflicts, and we just say what's daily life like for farmers, for merchants, for what have you. So if you just start with your average person, how is their life looking? That's a good way to start, and then obviously that would affect your characters, whether player characters or fiction, your written characters, how they interact with the world, and then you can kind of, because you got to think, especially if you're playing in in a game of some sort, most everyone in your players is your average person, right? So having just things expand from that standpoint, it's kind of what I like to try and do. It's like I don't know who runs my city that my players are in. I know that they know the butchers and the tailors and the people who work at the keep.
That's a great way to do it. Yeah, I mean that's that's a great point you made earlier about the commoner's perspective, because they said, like, for example, in Game of Thrones, Ned Stark is giving out justice, and there's a guy who calls him king, and he's like, I'm the hand, I'm not the king. And Ned's like, how could a guy live this close to King's Landing and not know what the king looks like? Well, it's hard to criticize Ned because we love Ned, but this is a good example of Ned's being kind of out of it. I mean, he's just not in touch with commoners because he is a high lord, as good a guy as he is. It's very easy for us to understand why this person doesn't know what the king looks like. They have no money. They live on their village, and this is maybe the first time they've ever left their village in their entire life. Why would they know what the king looks like? When did he come by? When did he go to their village? So it's just, like you said, it's really important to focus on like what the life of these commoners, or these temple guards, or these mercenary, whatever type of characters you're focusing on, what their day-to-day life would be like. If you go through that, you run into a lot of examples that they would run into, and that gives you fodder for what needs to be expanded on within your world.
Right.
Well, I guess we'll move on. We lost Shelby, but I assume she'll be back in a second here.
I have to assume as well.
Aha, there she is. Well, every time I say I'm sure you'll be right back, you are right back, like instantly. I'll just say that next time if you drop again, I'll say I'm sure Shelby will be right back, and then
okay. Was that one just me? Because like the entirety of StreamYard just decided to die.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. We were still going.
That's okay. We'll
I guess that's a good thing that we kept going. It's not a bad thing. We just moved the slide though, so if you had something else you wanted to say about the last one, feel free. We haven't started on this one yet.
I should be okay.
Okay. Well, why don't you kick us off then?
Oh yeah. So let's talk about race.
a not controversial topic.
Not in a controversial way.
Not at all.
When we talk about race, we're talking humanity, elven, orcish, not anyway. So the first thing we want to talk about is, what are the benefits of having a number of people that are primarily human, and you differentiate between the races of, say, you're a Northman versus a Dornishman? Or do you want to focus more on the fantasy elements? Are you a human? Are you an elf? Are you an orc? Or are you a gnome? Things of that nature. So some benefits to having that singularly as fantasy is you get a little more variety in what you can and can't do. It's definitely much harder to pull these kinds of things off in, say, a LARP versus an RP or writing out your own fantasy world. But things like Game of Thrones or the Hunger Games are much simpler when it's human to human. It's just much more real.
Yeah, so it'd be hard to LARP a very non-humanoid type character, for example.
That's the joke. Is my friends want to cosplay their D&D characters, and I'm all about that. My friends do. My partner, she cosplays she's an elf. In my game, she dresses an elf at fair constantly. My friend in there, he plays a lizard folk, so he's going to try and make himself a 7-foot tall lizard person for fair, and I won't stop him. But you have to see from at least a LARP standpoint how that can go. I think that is important with fantasy if you are sticking with a one race setting to still have that diversity. Because if we look at a lot of the the old examples of high fantasy, it's a lot of white dudes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
And that's
then
just
there's,
not fun.
and yeah, so it's a very much a, and I'm not from just a diversity standpoint of just like, make sure to throw in women, make sure to throw in people of color, have their own interesting identities. I've made sure to try and do that with the where I am. Even if in the high fantasy, you have
It's
the
a
more
world.
options.
It's not just one people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not just one people.
And these interactions between these worlds or these peoples are really important too. For example, to borrow a real world example, and then to port it over to fantasy. For example, you have cultures in the real world that are a little more closed than average, maybe you could say. And when people marry outside of their culture, sometimes this just makes them a bit of an outsider. And the children of those unions are sometimes considered outsiders. A great example of this, well, maybe not a great example of this, an example of this is the Yakuza, who a very, very disproportionate number of Yakuza are half Japanese, half Korean. And that's because they're somewhat outsiders from their own culture. And that is an easy enough thing to adapt in a fantasy world because it's familiar to the real world, this kind of belonging to both yet none kind of concept. People can group together. It allows some people who are in that sort of outsider category to band together to be stronger. And that, in its sense, there's all sorts of story fodder within that, right? Like plucky outsiders banding together, what have you, fighting back against much more powerful elements, things like that. And then in George R. Martin's world, he kind of borrows this concept a little bit, but changes it in that, for example, there's the vague sense that some of these ancient races may have mixed. It's not clear. Like there's the idea that maybe giant's blood is in people like Hodor, the mountain, maybe, or that the blood of the children of the forest might be in the Crannogmen, and that the dragon blood might be in the Targaryen, things like that. So even if it's not true, the idea that it could be creates stories and points of conflict.
Yeah. So again, pulling into your own worlds, try to keep in mind that no one group of people is the only group of people. And while most societies will try to blend together seamlessly, differences of religion, differences of culture, differences of beliefs will always clash in one way or another. The idea of superiority is unfortunately a natural trait in society. And no one's superior to one another as a whole, but some people may believe they are. So don't be scared of including class warfare, race warfare in your stories, because it is a very real problem that addressing it will fill out your characters and will fill out your world. Just do so in a respectful manner.
Yeah, that's it. Where it's what they session 0 of sorts is, what is everyone okay with? It can be any kind of social, political issue or anything. Is like, what is the players okay with? And you basically play until everyone is. You set the boundaries ahead of time so everyone's comfortable. But of course, you can always. I mean, yeah, in-game racism is a thing that happens sometimes. Or it can be blatant. It can just be a general mistrust. But it is a thing that could obviously happen in your cities. But it could just not. You could just try and avoid it, and no one's gonna say from Adam what not to do.
I feel like a really common trope that's really fun to use is the concept of a lost race or a lost culture, something that's ancient that still has an impact through its artifacts or its buildings or its whatever it's left over, and maybe they do or don't still exist in some remnant form. Like, you know, Game of Thrones is very straightforward with that in a lot of ways. You have the Valyrians were literally blown up. There's still a few of them out there here and there. Their culture exists in bits and pieces, but that creates an enormous number of large and small stories just from itself, all the things that they left behind and the cultures that were no longer all of a sudden just no longer have a ruler anymore, just it vanished. And that you could do so much with that. That's obviously a trope that everyone's familiar with in some form or another.
Absolutely. And that's another big benefit of having fantasy worlds is you can take genetics that otherwise should be dead and never show up again are somehow still present very strongly. Aziz brought up a wonderful point with, of course, the Valerians, and we see their traits passed down directly into the Targaryen line. Magical genetics is a wonderful thing in Game of Thrones and causes our first conflict and makes us lose Ned Stark. But that's how things go.
I see a good comment here from Hedgehogs and Cats Are Life says, don't give the racial minority really large noses and a tendency towards banking. Yeah, yes, please. That's a good comment. Yeah, like that's a really unfortunately recurring trope of, say, gnomes or goblins or whatever, that they're basically just anti-Semitism tropes. And a lot of times people use these not realizing that's what they're doing. They just repeat, it's just been done. And so they're borrowing from history and not realizing that this is problematic.
And I will say that it's a thing. I have no idea how old D&D worked, but I know at least from the 5e standpoint, a lot of the art has shifted a little bit. I know that I don't know if that's what gnomes originally looked like, but gnomes basically started going more slender and more pointy-eared.
Yeah, they're back to how they originally were. So gnomes originally come from Celtic lore and Germanic lore. When the two mixed, the idea of a gnome was the Germanic version of the wee folk. They were very small, slender, pixie-like, and they were there to cause trouble and help your household if you needed it, but they would always be for a price.
Yeah.
So,
you can always, if you look just through PHB, you'll see, every race is represented in multiple different forms of artwork, and that's always important. It can obviously portray in how your characters go. But obviously, if we're getting into the sake of bloodlines, that's obviously plays an important part in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think if even that happened in certain situations of succession within the books, of obviously somebody got more preference because they looked more like Targaryen or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly the look. George kept the looks maintaining more across multiple generations.
It feels magical. Into the odd things of how many races there technically are. Like Dorne has all 3 of the races, and from a odd standpoint, I'd say the North is also incredibly culturally diverse because they are first men. Do we count the Andals in the White Harbor as one? The Cranog men? What about the Mountain Folk? What about Skagos?
And the first men is just a generic term the Andals used for all the cultures that came together. So the first men really aren't one group. They just kind of became, they're kind of designated that way, but even they're probably more diverse than they sound on the top.
Right. And that's I feel like that's how the North really is. The North has they're all still Northmen, but they're all in many ways their own diverse kind of group.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So don't be afraid of diversity. Please try to stay away from stereotypes. Have some fun with it without purposefully being an asshole.
Yeah.
If you know for a fact this is a harmful stereotype or can figure it out with a Google search, maybe stick it in the trash and move on.
That's probably why you see a lot of repeating of fantasy races, because it's like, well, this one's tried and true, and it's like elves. Elves keep popping up. That's not really. I'm not aware of any harmful stereotypes around elves, so maybe there's some. I'm not.
I've known one. I have known one, and that is that high elves tend to be very Nazi-ish. And
okay, yeah, that's that is. You're right. That does kind of.
That's a little.
The Altmer and Skyrim are very blood purity based. They have, they're evil. They will kill a child if they believe this elf child is not genetically pure enough. To their own children. So imagine what they would do in just anybody else in Tamriel.
Yeah,
that's a good point. That's a recurring in a lot of different fantasy worlds. Elven blood is a big deal, whether it's purity or just having a trace of it makes you different or makes you bad or good. Like it's true in Lord of the Rings, it's true in The Witcher, it's true, and you can name a lot of stories where that matters.
Yeah, the dichotomy with the half elf, is very
yes. Bringing up mixed races. Oh my gosh! That's one thing I will never forgive D&D for. If you are a half elf or a half orc, cool. We know one side. What's the other?
Yeah. And why not other? Like, why do they always have to be half human?
Why is it always half human? What's so great about humans?
Well, they've given that to the sake for humans is that humans are like the ambition and the simple fact of like they have. I don't know how it portrays biologically.
A lot of bards.
Yeah, bards.
Bards.
it's they try and throw that in there for the sake of just because humans are so like they are the shortest, well, so usually some of the shortest lived. So this kind of they have this natural ambition kind of drive to them that is something that they try to portray, and I guess that leads to half elves and half orcs. I don't know what I'm saying.
And elves very often look down on humans because it's a recurring trope that elves are older and live longer but breed slower and less often. And I see a lot of that.
I'm moving for the comment section right now.
Yeah, you guys are doing great over in the comments. I see Kevin and Heathen King and Hedgehogs and Cats for Life.
So yes,
lots of good people.
Explore your mixed races. Cultures do interact. People of different races interact. They fall in love. They come together. Can you imagine? Well, I wish we actually had a visual of what would have happened. What the children of Eliana and Rhaegar would have looked like, because you have the very high Valyrian traits that are passed down very strongly, but you also have the Martells, whose traits are very noticeable from very far away, the sun-toned skin, and these are very opposing things.
Yeah. Maybe a Baelor Breakspear type look. He was certainly the combo. Purple eyes, but brown hair, yeah.
And a part of that magic genetics is where a lot of theories about Tyrion being perhaps Azor Ahai or a true Targaryen are coming from. The one purple eye that Tyrion has for some reason. No one knows, but it's a theory that maybe Tywin did some exploring with the dragons.
Well, we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. Let's do one more slide and we'll have to call it a day.
Magic.
Yeah.
Magic.
Speaking of dragons and stuff like that.
Speaking of dragons and burning people and all the crazy things that come with actually creating a fantasy world, magic is not only a power source, but an influencer. You must take into account, is magic a force that drives the geography or driven by the geography? Does it drive the culture or driven by the culture?
And is that active or past, right? Like, did it or does it, right?
Magic is one of those very odd things where, depending on how prevalent it is in the book, the LARP, the D&D campaign, the story that you're writing, can influence just about anything in any way you want. But in that case, it can also become very overpowered very quickly. So let's talk a little bit on what Aziz brought up. Is this past? Is this present? How does it influence push and pull on the different topics we've already spoken about?
Right.
So starting from gods and religion, apparently. Most times, religion and magic is hand in hand. The gods will cause something to happen, and it's believed to be a miracle or magical. And then humans will try to replicate it using magics of their own. We see Melisandre use it quite often. Although not quite as often until she takes off that dang age necklace. So we don't really realize until that moment, or until she does the Shadow Beast, that this isn't just her using religion as an excuse to call herself a magician. She truly is magical, and it is magic that she believes comes from the Lord of Light.
Yeah, and from her perspective, she's following visions that she has and misinterprets them a lot. And that's obviously, there's very much magic, and her cultural belief, the magic is where the visions come from, but her predetermined beliefs, what she expects to see, because she's kind of on this path that she expects to go a certain way, and she's looking for things that she expects to see. And so her belief system very much interprets her and very much colors her interpretation of these magical events. And that's one of my favorite examples from the books of an event that can be interpreted a number of different ways is the comet, because it's basically the only thing that every single POV has an option can see at the same time and then have a take on. And you notice, if you read the takes on the comet, they're all vastly different. Some people are like, oh, it's about me. Some people are like, oh, it's blood and death. And some people are like, oh, dragons are born again. And it's widely disparate answers to what it means, but they're all interesting, and you can see why these people would have these beliefs about it.
Right. Yeah. Because that's the thing of, I've seen plenty of theories based on the comet alone, what that means for the sake of magic, what that means for the sake of like science. science kind of plays into the world. But yeah, as far as, like I said, I mentioned this earlier, and I just want to get back to it, of how World of Ice and Fire is a very low magic setting, and it is a magic that comes with a price. Again, usually this is some form of a sacrifice. That is a lot of, oddly enough, fire magic or blood magic that you get these kind of, and I would say even shadow magic, that you're able to grasp from these, but it is not an easy magic to do. And again, it has a price involved with it. So as far as like, that's kind of how it works in this simple setting. However, again, it seems to have ebbs and flows, right? We've heard of, sorcerers or magicians being around for ages, and then it has gotten low. But since this comet has come back, we see more green seers. Bran now has his green seer. All the Stark children are wargs. Euron is doing God knows what.
God like what? Yeah.
It seems like he's hedging his bets on every faith for his own goal. Again, we don't know what will happen.
I think we are out of time. We got some extra time, and we've exceeded that, so we got to shut this down. But this was really fun, and it just goes to show how much there is on this topic. We didn't.
Yep. So just a quick rundown of the few facts. It'll take less than a minute. Pulling up hedgehogs and cats are life. Yes, that was our very next point. Geography can be influenced by magic. How powerful magic was in the past can either cause you to literally yeet a river into your control or split a mountain. And maybe as it dies, your place loses that ability to do so.
Broken Arm of Dorne. Anybody? Similar concept. Yeah.
Magic influences pretty much everything, or you can have magic dying in your world, like it is in Westeros. All right. Hopefully the next time I do a panel on world building, it'll be on these further topics. When creating a world, try to think about the lore and legends that you'd bring in. Are there folk stories that are commonly told? Are there different stories that have been warped around and are now these glorified heroes or villains? Think about your calendars. Think about your holidays. We know that the Westerosi calendar runs on two seasons, and that's it. We still don't know how their years work, but whatever. Think about combat systems. Is it a singularly melee system, or is magic involved in fighting as well? Make sure you set those boundaries. And then beyond the borders of your first couple of cities and kingdoms, how do you interact with places that are yet unseen? So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Aziz and Mark, for doing this.
Thank you, Shelby.
Super fun. I'm sorry that my internet sucks.
We understand.
Well, thank you to fellow panelists, everyone who has been going through the comments with us through this. I want to also make sure to thank Tara.
Yeah, thanks, Tara.
Thank you, Tara.
This all going on. It's been tricky for all of us, and I just want to make sure everyone's staying safe and healthy and sane in their own ways. Hopefully, that's why I'm glad we were able to do this, even though we're not all together like we wish we could be.
I know. If anyone would like a copy of the PowerPoint or any singular slide from the PowerPoint, you guys have my Facebook. It's Shelby Taylor. I'm pretty easy to find, I think.
Yeah.
Contact one of us and they'll reach out to me, and I will send you guys screenshots of the slides. So
thanks, everybody. Love you.
I won't see you in November, but I'll see you next April.
We will see you all soon enough.
See you at other panels too, everybody.
Bye.